Right. Super. They should be able to hear you now, Jack. So
okay,
yeah, whenever you
so
do a scare us.
welcome to the History of Ideas and Political Thought Reading Club. We've been running these seminars for about a year. We did a series on liberty originally. That's how we started. And the basic idea is we're meeting to discuss some of the more influential, informative works in our history, to understand them more in their own context, rather than reading too much backwards into the past. Which Sam's discipline, this is something he's quite concerned about. He does the history of ideas, and his discipline sort of emerged in the context of trying to get more clarity about which of our concepts are appropriate when we go 100, 200, 300, 1,000 years back into the past in some of these works. So we just started a new series called Heritage. A couple of weeks ago we read Plato's Republic. We read the third book, which deals with basically Plato's critique of tradition and of culture. Socrates said in the dialogue that the poets and the artists are spreading all kinds of lies about the gods, which are not conducive to good moral formation for the citizens of the ideal state. And so they have a long conversation about what kind of poetry is acceptable, what kind of music is acceptable, all based on what it does to the person who consumes it. What kind of emotion does it stir? What kind of emotions? The question then is asked: do we want the ideal citizens to sort of be habitually having habitually stirred in them? You know, they want to be not too effeminate but not too brutish. That was the thinking. Okay, we have this week Augustine City of God, a work in a similar vein, exploring the limits of heritage and tradition for moral formation, some of the places where it goes wrong, but then also offering an alternative vision for what you might call the true roots of moral formation. So I'll begin with a Great, okay. So I'll just give a brief introduction to the life of Augustine, who's pictured here very beautifully on this wonderful cover of his most famous book, The Confessions. This is his own autobiography, the very first autobiography. Very beautiful book, and a very beautiful translation this is, by Henry Chadwick, I do recommend. So Augustine is born into North Africa, modern Algeria, into an irreligious Catholic family. Enrolled into a school in Carthage, received a classical education, studied Latin, Greek. He's not so fond of the Greek. He doesn't like the Greek so much. He actually struggles a lot with the language, which is reassuring for those of us who recognise how incredible an intellect his was. We struggle ourselves, so did he. By his 20s, he was well known among his contemporaries in the region to be proficient in rhetoric, have an exceptional memory, and to be a competent teacher. But he was regarded as a heretic because he adopted the theosophy of the Manichaeans, who were a shoot-off sect of Catholicism, which dominated the region of North Africa. They were basically pantheist, so they took the view that God was in the thing. That's quite significant for Augustine's intellectual journey and his moral journey. The Confessions is the story of his conversion to Catholicism, and he has to go through a series of intellectual obstacles to get there. And the first is he has no idea what on earth immaterial substance could be, which would be the kind of being of the soul or of God. He has no idea what that means, and it wasn't until he read the works of Platonists like Plotinus that it occurred to him what that could be. So he has to go through that, and so he has to, as it were, shed his Manichaean heritage. So he goes to Rome upon the death of a close friend. He goes to Milan shortly after. He's hosted there by St. Ambrose, who's a very famous church father and bishop, who always gave reportedly very powerful speeches on church doctrine and the scriptures, which were very influential on Augustine. He is able to study more authentic astronomy, which is another blow to some of the Manichaean ideas he received, which was more astrology, if you see. So he's becoming more aware of the substance to Christian teaching. And he has a very dramatic conversion in the garden in Milan where he had a complete breakdown because it occurs to him that he cannot will himself to will the good. Because besides his intellectual journey, he's also been struggling with many personal vices. He's very lustful and licentious. He sleeps around a lot. He's very prideful, and it all becomes too much for him. And he comes to understand what all that means, and had a very powerful conversion. 5 years after that, he's ordained a priest, and in even less time, he becomes bishop. And then he's out there defending Christianity against all the heresies he was raised in, including the Donatists, who had a view of Christianity that was closer to social revolution, and the Pelagians, who had a view of it where it was more like primarily resting on our own effort rather than something that you might receive from God. Okay. That's the background to his life and work. In 410, can you get that? Oh God. There we go. Okay. In 410, Rome is sacked by the Visigoths following a long period of moral, social, and political decline. People begin to consider that the consequence of this catastrophe was the abandonment of the old gods of pagan Rome. And so, in his second and last major work, Augustine sets about trying to defend the Christians against this charge. And so, in the course of doing it, he then develops this very rich allegory of two cities, the city of man and the city of God. Basically, two allegories for trying to understand what the ideal city-state might look like. So very much.
Oh, God. Sorry, Jack.
That's the second person that's done that now.
Okay. Great. Got no one heard. So like the Republic, you're trying to understand an ideal version of history, basically, of the state. And underpinning all that is almost a step ahead of Plato, and informed by his Christian inheritance, a view of history as rational, as purposeful, which we bring under the term of providence, which I can't remember if you here at the last talk.
Yeah, we covered some.
Yeah, we sort of ended there. We didn't get to sort of go so much into it. Maybe we'll get there this time. Essentially, providence being the idea that history is the progressive working out of the salvation of man, culminating in the second coming of Christ. Why?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. More detail on the sacking of Rome. Basically, the empire was fractured in two. So you had the death of Theodosius, and his two sons were basically adopted by two competing prefects, one in the west, one in the east. And Flavius, so Rufinus in the east, he's trying to persuade the Visigoths to invade the west. They have some altercations. In the end, Rufinus is assassinated. Flavius wards off the Visigoths the first time round, but then rumours spread that he's trying to put his own son on the throne, so Honorius has him executed. But there's no one to defend the Romans when they come the second time, and that is the famous sacking of Rome that basically spawns the writing of the City of God. So we have the words from Augustine here right at the very beginning. I've undertaken this defence against those who prefer their own gods to the founder of this city. The city surpassingly glorious, whether we view it, for it still lives by faith in its fleeting course of time, and sojourns as a stranger in the midst of the ungodly. Whether it shall dwell in the fixed security of eternal sleep, which it now patiently wait for, expecting righteousness, shall turn unto judgment, and obtained by virtue of excellence, final victory and perfect peace. Right, would you like drinks? We've got some wine, we've got some...
I think she's gone to get a couple of glasses, Jack.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, that's fine. We do have one in the meantime. Would you like to have got one?
Thank you.
Go.
Sorry, we're late.
No worries. I just gave a brief introduction to Augustine's life and work. And we're going to... Yeah, good. Oh, yeah, we have a lemonade? So I just gave a brief introduction to Augustine's life and works. So, and it gave little excerpt there from the opening. He basically defined his task as defending the Christians from the claim that they're responsible for the moral decline of the Romans. And this book becomes then a historical study, a philosophical study into Rome's history, its values. Very much like the Republic, what values do you need for the state to function? What is the purpose of the state? And so forth. Okay, so what I want to try and do for the rest of the session is have a group discussion about some of these themes. So we've got some quotations to guide that discussion. I'll try and ask some questions. You're all very free to jump in. We'll see how it goes. So I want to.
So I remember we had I can't remember the exact content of our discussion last time, but I remember raising the question about the social context, and you've covered some of it here, but the social context is around the fact that the Roman Empire is in decline, society is unstable, maybe fragmenting, and therefore for people living at the time, there's a lot of uncertainty around, how should they govern themselves and what should they, and it seems to me, and I mentioned this I think last time, about what was, within that context, what were his motives, as opposed to what were his religious beliefs, what was his theology, what were his motives. And motives in the sense where I would say, cynically, to see an opportunity around all this uncertainty that's going on, and use that opportunity to leverage a benefit for Catholicism, for the Christian Church, for himself. Off the conditions, which in my view would drive the writing of this kind of work, from the theological beliefs, which is the rational grounding for. So I just wonder if that's a fair division. Theology stands.
Well, this is something we can investigate. I think there's some truth to it. This is a very intelligent, very strategically written book. So if we just look at the second paragraph here, so this first paragraph here is about sort of a basic observation which spawns the whole discussion. And not the very Romans who were spared by the barbarians through their respect for Christ become enemies to the name of Christ. The reliquaries of the martyrs and the churches of the apostles bear witness to this. For in the sack of the city there were open sanctuaries for and fled them, whether Christian or pagan. To this very threshold the bloodthirsty enemy raged, then his murderous fury owed a limit. Whether the touch of an enemy has had any pity convey those to whom they have given quarter, lest any less mercifully disposed might fall upon them. He goes on, basically saying, do we have a... Oh, it's just reconnecting. Okay, fine. Basically saying, it was reported that the barbarians, Visigoths who invaded, were killing everyone until they reached the threshold of the churches, and for some reason everyone in the churches was spared.
So his own one was ransacked.
Sorry?
His own one was ransacked.
Right, okay.
Sort of around that time, which is sort of what I was thinking when Peter was talking about it. But I think that's later than this, because that's further on in the fall.
Okay. Oh yes, it's a long process. Okay, so he's right at this stage, you think. He begins there, framing the question of basically of divine intervention, the question of providence. He then bolsters it. Even Caesar himself gives us positive testimony regarding this custom of sacking a city. For in his deliverance in the Senate about the conspirators, he says, as Sallust, a historian of distinguished veracity, writes, the virgins and boys are violated, children torn from the embraces of their parents, matrons subjected to whatever should be the pleasure of their conquerors, and so on and so on. Basically, even Rome's own historians show us this is really odd. It's really unusual. So
I remember we talked about this, about him referencing other people and what was the factual basis, and the fact is he's referencing people who themselves didn't have a factual basis for what they were saying, and he was treating them as facts, which kind of strengthened his case without actually having any real facts in opinion, his argument.
Yeah, it's difficult because I think I put a counter objection. Is it limited on what people know in their own day about the quality and extent of good historical research in their time? Is this all the authority they have to go off of? The authority all of the citizens of Rome read who received an education. I don't think he's drawing off an evidence base that's particularly differentiated So the malice can't quite be there if there is any, and I don't think there
agree
is.
it's not malice.
But it's important that he is trying to persuade an audience of this. It's a very intelligent work. So he's going to cite all of the Roman sources which he knows very intimately. We have Caesar, we have Sallust, later we have Varro, Cicero. Cicero was the most influential writer, thinker on Augustine. Okay. The first objection he then considers is that not all of the Christians were entirely exempt from death and suffering in this event. He writes, but they fancy they bring a conclusive charge against Christianity when they aggravate the horror of captives by adding that not only wives and unmarried maidens, but even consecrated virgins were violated in the siege. Let this therefore in the first place be laid down as an unassailable position, that the virtue which makes the life good has its throne in the soul, and thence rules the members of the body, which becomes holy in virtue of the holiness of the will, and that while the will remains firm and unshaken, nothing that another person does with the body or upon the body is any fault of the person who suffers, so long as he cannot escape it without sin. So, what's Augustine's point here? Why is this relevant? What are they objecting to?
Is that on screen?
Oh, sorry.
You mean one.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I suppose it's an interesting point about free will, in that obviously God gave us free will, and the true moral judgment in Christianity is our exercise of that free will. And if that free will is taken away, be it by something that is voluntarily happens to you, that cannot, per se, be an attack on your virtue and morality.
Yeah.
I think he's saying submit to authority.
Okay. Can you explain that, really?
We should not take the law into our own hands. We should take the law that is given to us, and that would eventually be the law of the church, as a substitute or complementing the Roman law as it would have been. So I think he's moving towards a position where he says, you as individuals, the church will tell you, how to believe, what to believe, how to worship, and what your fate is. I think that's the general position I think he's moving towards. Yeah,
moving towards, potentially, but here we don't have any reference to the church as of yet.
No.
We're receiving here a doctrine about virtue and about what virtue relationship is to the body and relationship to suffering. Whether what you suffer is somehow indicative of your moral state, which I think is quite radical. In that the Romans had a long history of honor killings. Most famously Cato the Elder, or Cato the Younger, I always mix them up, who was an esteemed statesman. He was like the most noble guy in Rome in his day, and he was a contemporary of Caesar. He was quite old though at the time Caesar came to power, and he really made it his life work. He came from very rural Italy. He made it his life work to clean up the Senate, which is a hell of a job. And he eventually is just sort of, he hits a wall. There's too many factions, and Caesar really just overpowers him politically and ends up confining him to house arrest and gives him the option to kill himself sort of tacitly, and he does in the end. And this was very common in Rome. And where does that attitude come from in the Roman tradition? It comes from an association between the suffering or your failure, your present state, and your moral worth, let's say. So Augustine seeks to differentiate this, not as a question of what you suffer in the body or in the world, politically or socially, but what is the state of your will? What's the moral state of your will? And so I think it's important to note that, because in this passage we see that suffering does seem to be a moral judgment. I'm changing it on my screen, but not yours, sorry. In this passage, suffering is tied to a moral judgment. The Romans are being judged by God. But here, the Christians, the good Christians and the good whoever, are not being judged by the virtue of their suffering. Is that a contradiction? Potentially not, if we accept this principle that it's all about the will and how the will forms you. It's not about what you suffer on the surface. So this is an important detail in Augustine's argument, which we can unpack a little bit more under the heading of temporal suffering. What do you suffer in the body or in the world? What is the relationship between that and virtue? He elaborates here on the connection to the Roman attitude. But it's these gods, the Roman gods, who were worshipped, especially in this behalf, that they might confer happiness in this life, either willed or permitted these punishments, the siege, to be inflicted on one who kept his oath to them. What more cruel punishment could they, in their anger, have inflicted on a perjured person? By his own example, in fact, he taught that the gods do not secure the temporal happiness of their worshippers. On the torture of the Roman, so this is him speaking about the torture of the Roman general Regulus at Carthage during the days of Cicero. So Regulus was a very pious man, and he suffers. So why does a pious suffer? This is related to the previous question. Why do the Christians suffer if this is a providential event? Because the will was rightly formed, let's say, hypothetically. Why does Regulus suffer? That question isn't answered, but the important thing is that there's no obvious correlation between the temporal suffering and the moral worse. So if you put it in a reverse relation, if I worship the gods, that doesn't mean I don't suffer. This is a defect in Roman thinking that Augustine wants to correct. And he applied it consistently to the Christian faith. If I believe in the Christian God, I still may suffer. If I believe in the Roman God, contrary to Roman thinking, I also suffer. So this raises the whole question: what is the relationship between suffering and meaning? What is the purpose of life if it isn't to avoid suffering? So this is whole new territory opening up. What is the purpose of the state?
And how do you actually build a state?
And how do you build a state?
Yes. That we discussed last time as well, because there is a sense that, yes, he's drawing on Platonic ideas a lot when it comes to the kind of political superstructure of like sort of this idealized city of God, where suffering in the city of man will thereby sort of reveal the true will of those who will ascend to the city of God. But there's no actual sense of politics as ever improving or politics as ever coming into the city of man. And I think this is where we sort of had quite a bit of discussion the last time, but like there's no idea that the city of God can be implemented in the city of man in any sense, in terms of a idealized state that could be implemented, which we debated last week, whether or not Plato actually believes that that's the case in terms of the Republic. But you know, when you look at someone like Aquinas, there is an idea that politics can improve the individual as well as improve the state by participation, and by good participation, by effective participation. It can improve our virtue, and it can much more sort of, I guess, sort of Aristotelian in the sense that it can improve us by participating, becoming civic, becoming sort of neighbourly, this sort of thing, and it can improve the state. You don't get a sense from Augustine and arguably Plato that the state actually will improve from where it is. And this is part of, sorry, just ramble on for
No.
30 more seconds, but this is also part of what you were saying, Peter, about the context, which is this is declinist literature. This is very similar to the period that I write about in the 18th century, in the sense of you're watching, well, first of all, we're looking at someone who's writing on the margins of an empire, so a peripheral observer, so a difference to Plato. Plato's in Athens, he's immersed in the state. We've got to remember that Augustine is in modern-day Tunisia. He's writing very much on the periphery of the Roman Empire, and he's watching a central state fall apart from a distance. Now, just like in the 18th century with romantics looking at kind of industrial England, for example, and they're looking at corruption and vice seeping into London or seeping into, you know, the modern, what the romantics would call kind of cesspits of industry. They're thinking, well, society's going to fall apart. You know, it's inevitable. You know, there's corruption, there's, you know, money circulating, there's vice everywhere. In a very similar way, this is what Augustine is looking in on from a distance, from the very edges, the margins of the Roman Empire. And I think going back to temporal suffering, there isn't much of a sense of how do you reach the idealized state, and that's what I struggle with in terms of it, looking at it as a political text. How do you reach that state, other than sort of formation, of the will? But like, it's a bit of a struggle to use that as your one vindication of a political text to say, well, if we all cultivate a goodwill through enough suffering, then maybe we'll all sort of reach. It's very eschatological, kind of like, and that will be at the end.
Well, in defence of Augustine, I actually do think he advocates that you can, that this return to the will is it's like the mustard seed, the parable of the mustard seed. It seems quite insignificant, but I think he structured his argument in such a way where that actually, the secondary phenomenon, to be sure, does positively contribute to the body politic.
Yeah.
He gets that from Cicero, as we'll see in the next slide, but I think you also start to see it a bit here, in the second paragraph. I've still got the right page ahead. They ought rather, the Romans, have they any right perception to attribute the severity and hardships inflicted by their enemies to that divine providence which is wont to reform the depraved manners of men by chastisement, and which exercises with similar affliction the righteous and praiseworthy. And then in the last sentence, that death is not to be judged an evil, which is the end of a good life, for death becomes evil only by the retribution which follows it. So, beginning to connect suffering to opportunity for moral formation.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so what is that going to do practically? That's your question. That's a very good question. I think Cicero has the answer for us here. And this is Augustine quoting Cicero. So this comes in book 2, I think.
So I just want to summarise in my. I'm fairly cynical about the theology side of it. So my interpretation is a bit sort of. So it seems to me what he's saying is your temporal masters, don't base your hope on them. They won't deliver. It's something along those lines, saying that they will not deliver a better life, escape from suffering, etc. In this temporal life, and to the extent that you suffer, it's either your enemies or your own fault that you suffer. It feels to me like that's what he's saying, and he's setting up the groundwork to say, here's what we can do. Here's life after death, and so on. That's where your salvation will come. So knuckle under and just wait for that. So and I would say, and I know there's a conflict between what we've experienced over the 1600 years since and what he saw in those days, but actually empirically we know that actually temporal laws can improve our lives. So it feels to me that his argument, although he has an argument, is ultimately not a well-founded argument, and that's an empirical fact. Is that a fair criticism?
I would challenge that a bit. It's difficult to say that Augustine is only associating temporal suffering with blame. It's a little bit more complicated. It depends what you think about original sin. That's the first problem, which is a very complicated subject. So I think the most charitable way to put it is that everything that happens to you is not necessarily directly a fault of your own, but what it is an opportunity, and a needed opportunity for you to become more than you are. I would put it that way. And it's a moral imperative to engage with all of the suffering that you suffer in your life in that way, in the spirit of trying to grow in the virtues of faith, hope, and charity being a theological virtue. So to trust in the essential providence and goodness of all that befalls you, but then also practical virtues like humility and forbearance, and courage, and so forth. So it's not that you can't always say, you certainly can't from an outside view looking at an individual say you were suffering for this. This is what the book of Job is all about in the Old Testament, which conclude you can't correlate, and what he's already been saying, you can't correlate the suffering with the virtue. It's a matter of will, and that is it's to some degree private, but also people do make their intention known, and they have certain behaviours and so forth, and so you can gauge something of their moral state potentially, but there's an aspect of that which is hidden. So the stronger point for me, I think, sort of reading back, is the divine providence which is wont to reform the depraved manners of men by chastisement. Very harsh way of saying that, whatever is wrong in you, this is how we're going, this is your opportunity to sort of grow out of it. And this is taking on a more blunt version of that general principle, because it is a book about the reformation of Rome, what he believed to be an act of God trying to reform Rome.
But none of that makes your temporal masters unable to improve your lives.
I don't think that we haven't encountered anything with respect to temporal masters or temporal laws quite yet. What do you think might be the sequence to that?
Well, I feel the sequence is abandon hope here. Okay, come to the church. That's what I think. That's my feeling about the underlying logic of what he's.
Because he does quite fundamentally say the city of God will never be emulated in the city of man. There is no telos in this book in terms of it will ever reach that.
Yeah.
At least in the Republic, there is an idea, a very thin idea, that the Republic could be realised. There is certainly no transferal of the city of God into the city of man. It might somewhat try and emulate it, but as a political... No,
I want to propose that it's too black and white a way of looking at it, because yes, it will never be realised, but part of what we're about to see, I think, part of the project of your moral formation for a Christian is to go out into the world.
Yeah, and supersede. Yeah,
it's not something you can do independently of the world, independently of other people. And so if you get your principles and virtues in order, that is going to spill out positively into the world. So you are in your small corner going to emulate the city of God. Is that scalable? In principle, yes. In practice, that's very difficult. And yeah, so and Augustine does have a sense that he knows how it all ends. In the end, it all fails. But for our time, maybe we can
advocate withdrawal from politics in this, but it's not going to help.
No,
and this is also the peripheral element, I think. Again, contextually featuring in that, like, the core is corrupt. As far away as you can get from the core is the best place to be.
But it's submission. You feel like more like submission, so withdraw rather than fight it, or and I understand the teleological thing of improve yourself, improve your life, be virtuous.
But there's no telos for the state.
But there's also no the reward doesn't come in this life.
Yes,
it still comes in the next life. So, which it feels a little.
Well, in this sense, the political is subordinated to the theological. But man's ends cannot be, in Augustine's view, in this world, because this world is transient. And politics is the most clear example of that, how regimes rise and fall, and what the state is aiming for changes so much. In Augustine's view, the body politic correlates with the view that the final end of human life is happiness. But that view doesn't make sense of suffering, because so much suffering is arbitrary. And so that's why what he's trying to show is that what transcends suffering is the will, and then that already points to the city of God. So we do what we can with this world, only with our eye looking toward the city of God, and that's where we're aiming to end up. And by accident, everything else can sort of unfold around in a good way. Not by accident, but in a secondarily way. It's entirely rational. No choice of words on my part. But it's it's not done just for that sake. It's not done for the sake of that result. It's done in and of itself because it's good to do for yourself, for your soul.
That would be consistent with good government, good governance, but he doesn't promote that. So between arbitrary and self-improvement, you have Leviathan, you have government,
Yes.
which he doesn't promote.
No, that's true. That's true. Small city states. That's his idea.
And that comes back to the historical position that we can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cicero, have we got it? Yeah, Cicero ideal state. So again, this is Augustine quoting Cicero, another one of his strategic moves, and it's really a man who he had a lot of respect for intellectually. But Cicero begins by quoting Scipio, who was Scipio was a general. I think Scipio is the general who crosses the Alps in chasing. Is it Hannibal?
Hannibal's, yeah.
Yeah. And he's marched all the way around from Spain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. So like Plato's Republic, Cicero's De Republica is also a dialogue between Cicero himself and then his version of Scipio and maybe another character. Scipio says, where reason is allowed to modulate the diverse elements of the state, there is obtained a perfect concord from the upper, lower, middle classes, as from various sounds. And what musicians call harmony in singing is concord in matters of state, which is the strictest bond and best security of any republic, and which by no ingenuity can be retained where justice has become extinct. And then Cicero adds, Scipio expresses his willingness to have the maxim that the republic cannot be governed without injustice discussed, and sifted, and gave it his opinion that it was baseless. Okay, so let's start with just that paragraph. Yeah, what do they? How do they understand the structure of the state here? How might it connect to virtue? Yeah,
That
What
was
you
me
trying to
signaling
get
that
at?
one.
What do you make of the analogy between the musicians and the state?
Everyone has their place.
Mm.
Yeah, there are roles.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether you think your role is, you're born to your role or you move to your role.
That's
Probably born to your role, I imagine.
I think that's probably the case, a bit closer to Plato, but
I think that he's saying, in the same way that the beautiful thing about music or for musicians is like hitting the right harmony of all the instruments, is the same thing with society, that everybody is living in harmony as in a society.
Yeah.
Should be.
Yeah.
and
Well, that's the harmony.
And what do you think is the basis for that harmony? Might not be quite there,
That's a
but
very big
maybe.
question.
Sorry?
That's a very big question.
Yeah, very big question. Yeah. Or conversely, what is the root of disharmony in the state?
In this state.
In states in general. Or what is the source of disharmony in ourselves?
Mm.
And is there a relationship between those two?
I would say sin.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
say like acceptance of each other.
Okay. Yeah. I want to come back to what's sin.
In terms of like sin coming into the world and the fallen world, which is the separation between man and God. So it's the nature of, I guess, the world and ourselves.
Okay.
Now that we like are in now. So I kind of like battling between the flesh and spirit and like
So
I guess in the Christian.
So it's like battle between different principles.
Yeah.
So
Between the good and the virtuous, and then the sin and the selfishness, the ego, and all that.
oh, okay, yeah, selfishness. Okay. So the turn inward. That connects, I think, maybe to what you were saying about acceptance of others.
Guess so.
Okay.
Accepting, like, well, I guess in a more general way, like other people's principles and morals and virtues.
Oh no, we have a conflict here.
In a
We have
more
a conflict
personal
here.
way, I guess, of accepting somebody's
Yeah.
sins.
Oh, this is interesting. No, let me explain. Well, do you perceive the conflict?
Yeah.
What is the conflict?
That I mean it more from a wider viewpoint. That Hannah means it more in a, like, talking about sin, so more personal.
It's not about viewpoint. You struck on unity. And fragmentation of unity in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So through sin and through selfishness and through vice. So we're divided because we all want different things, let's say.
Yeah.
But you put the view forward that actually if we just accepted that other people wanted different things, then there would be unity. So there is a tension there. That's interesting. Let's see what Cicero has to say. That's very good, thank you. Rome's severe morality and her citizens are her safeguard. This verse, says Cicero, seems to me to have all the sententious truthfulness of an oracle, for neither would the citizens have availed without the morality of the community, nor would the morality of the commons without the understanding of men have availed either to establish or so long to maintain in rigour so grand a republic with so wide and just an empire. Accordingly, before our day, the hereditary usages formed our foremost men, and they on their part retained the usages and institutions of their fathers. But our age, receiving the republic of the chef d'oeuvre of another age, which has already begun to grow old, has not merely neglected to restore the colours of the original, but has not even been at the pains to preserve so much of the general outline of its most astounding features. Morality has perished through the poverty of great men, a poverty for which we must not only assign a reason, but for the guilt of which we must answer as criminals charged with a capital crime. For it is through our vices and not by any mishap that we retain only the name of a republic and have long since lost the reality. Very damning words from Cicero. What did he say?
He was saying at one time the leaders of society, let's say the senators in the Senate, acted in the interests of that society, of the people of that society, the general interests by and large. But over time, corruption and moral failings in those individuals, probably due to an excess of wealth and power, has led to a decline in their paying attention to the needs of the people. So that's the poverty of great men.
Yeah. Because, just to add detail, because they fall away specifically from the hereditary usages, of the institutions of their fathers. Yeah. So Cicero envisages a connection between the sort of tradition of strong moral formation and civic duty, which has fallen away, which has been abandoned. Does that shed any light on the discussion we had over here? Because I think, so we begin with this image of the state as harmony. So we've got this is the ultimate difficulty with politics, and why I don't necessarily fall on. It's a complicated debate. Do we prioritise the unity or the multiplicity in people? And Cicero does give priority to the unity, but the image of harmony suggests that it does have multiplicity in it, but the unity has to be foremost. And this is sort of embodied in a tradition which is handed down, which Cicero thinks the Romans of his day, which is maybe 200 years before, 200, 300 years before Augustine is writing, have completely abandoned it. And so it seems that, what would you say? He doesn't give so much detail about what those virtues and vices are that are particularly, they're responsible for this. But he gives you the general outline that we need virtuous people who are united by a common sense of what morality is, And I think this is probably where, in Cicero's view and in Augustine's view, what you put forward, Hannah, is probably a bit more closer to the ideal view of the state, because there is a common conviction about what constitutes sin and what constitutes virtue, but and then the multiplicity comes more in how people serve the state and maybe the different ways they might do that. That's sort of the way they think at this time. So the unity is very much paramount in ancient thinking. We can have a discussion later about how that might have changed in modern times, but
there's also the corporeal element as well. You know, the language of corporeal kind of body politic states as well. So obviously, the sort of metaphor that's being used here is the orchestra, the harmony, the beauty of kind of like everything in tune, everything resonating together. But it could easily be, you know, the kind of sort of more, which we've already seen earlier on, but sort of the same as in Plato, kind of like, you know, an infected part of the body politic is the same as an infected psyche, or these kind of bits that start to fracture. And there's lots of Victorian terms for this: self-actualization, Bradley's knowing your station, these kind of things. Like that, if each element of society is not working at its sort of crux, at its potential possibility frontier, then the state itself is fundamentally failing, because each of those individual elements are not working in harmony or working in a healthy, if we're talking about often the language used in body politic discussion, whether it's Hobbes or someone later, that they're not healthy. But obviously this is the language of music, this is the language of it's not in harmony, it's not resonating, it's not,
exactly.
Yeah, which is quite interesting, because I don't think today we'd ever have such a fundamental obsession with everything working at the crux of potential. You know, we have an idea that the state functions if everything's kind of just about slotting into gear, but this is a kind of discussion of everything. The only time at which the state is working perfectly is if everything's at its complete sort of harmony with one another.
If I were to paraphrase what you're saying, if I understand, so Cicero sort of putting forward a moral principle for the unity, whereas maybe in modern times it's more of a practical principle.
Yes,
a technical principle. Of the separate institutions. Okay.
And much more pragmatic as well.
I think that
it's not this kind of idealized version of, because obviously in centuries gone by it was much easier to institute a sense of station, a sense of kind of knowing your place in the kind of like structured kind of organisation of the state, which is sort of, you know, these vague kind of philosophical terms. Well, if you go back to the Greek eudaimonia in terms of flourishing, but through to kind of modern political discourse, self-actualization, or kind of reaching your potential as an individual within the state.
Okay, that's very good. I think for Cicero, the unifying principle is justice, and like in Plato, it was also justice. You see, it does have it's pragmatic to an extent, but then it does have the moral quality, but they do explore it in very practical ways. Perhaps for Augustine, for the first time, it's becoming something much more purely moral, independent of results. So maybe closer to eudaimonia, because Augustine ultimately believes that the fulfillment of the human person is happiness, but the happiness is only found in its fullness in the city of God, not in this world. You can get traces of it. He believes that everything in this world is somehow a privation of something higher. So you get elements of it, but not the full thing. If I understand. Okay, so from Augustine, I'll get a bit of a summary of what saints were like. But I'll just paraphrase. But the worshippers and admirers of these gods delight in imitating their scandalous iniquities, and are nowise concerned that the republic be left to praise in licentious. Only let it remain undefeated, they say. Only let it flourish and abound in resources. Let it be glorious by its victories, or still better secure in peace. And what matters it to us? This is our first concern, that every man must be able to increase his wealth so as to supply his daily prodigalities, and so that the powerful may subject the weak for their own purposes. That the poor call the rich for a living, and that under their protection they may enjoy sluggish tranquility. Let the rich abuse the poor as their dependents to minister to their pride. Let the people applaud not only those who protect their interests, but those who provide them with pleasure. Let no severe duty be commanded, no impurity forgiven. forbidden. Let kings estimate their prosperity not by their righteousness, but by the civility of their subjects. Blah, 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 blah. Let there be a plentiful supply of public prostitutes for everyone who wishes to use them, but specifically for those who are too poor to keep one for their private use. Let there be erected houses of the largest and most ornate description. In them let there be provided the most sumptuous banquets, where everyone who pleases may, by day or night, play, drink, vomit, dissipate. Let these be reckoned the true gods who procure for the people this condition of things, and preserve it when once possessed. A remarkable passage. He's obviously not advocating these things. What's he trying to do?
Well, I'm going to, so the point that comes to my mind, and coming back to the point earlier, let kings estimate their prosperity not by their righteousness, but by the civility of their subjects.
Mm.
Yeah, that's the point I was making earlier about ceding to authority, and let people, give the people what they want within that context. Give the people actually, in particular, give the men what they want. Probably.
Yeah.
Anything for the women there? I'm not sure there is.
The banquets, maybe. Probably not. No, but
Opportunities to grow.
Yeah, but this is an Augustine view of things.
Yeah, but that's a very personal view of the morality that humanity should rise to.
Yes. So this is his view of the Roman state of affairs. So you get it fragmented in all these different ways. Its wealth and its power and its sexuality and gluttony, all these things going wrong in the state. I think it has a lot to do with what you just mentioned, Hannah, the inward sort of turn, the selfishness. That's sort of what Augustine's trying to pinpoint, sort of all the different ways that manifests itself. The consequence of that, impurity of will, impurity of intention towards others, this is how all the vice seeps into the state, because individuals are not making the right decisions for what's best for them and for other people. So this is the sense in which the relationship between my individual moral destiny and the body politic is very clear for Augustine. It's very clear. It was for Cicero. So what it means for the state to have harmony is to figure out sort of the root of that problem that you just outlined there. Where does all of this selfishness come from? He presents a more penetrating analysis even here. Let them, true God, let them ask them whether it is quite fitting for good men to rejoice in extended empire, if therefore by carrying on wars that were not just, not impious, or unrighteous, the Romans could have acquired so great an empire, ought they not to worship as a goddess, even the injustice of foreigners? For we see that this has cooperated much in extending the empire by making foreigners so unjust that they became people with whom just wars might be carried on, and the empire increased. And why may not injustice, at least of that of the foreign nations, also be a goddess, if fear and dread and ague have deserved to be Roman gods? By these two, therefore, that is, by foreign injustice and the goddess Victoria, for injustice stirs up the cause of war, and Victoria brings these same wars to a happy termination, the empire has increased, even though Jove has been idle. For what part could Jove have here? When those things which might be thought of to be his benefits are held to be gods, called gods, worshipped as gods, and are themselves invoked for their own parts. He also might have some part here if he himself might be called empire, just as she is called victory. Or if empire is the gift of Jove, why may not victory also be held to his gift? And it certainly would have been held to be so had he been recognised and worshipped, not as a stone in the capital, but as the true King of kings and Lord of lords. I should have cut it in half. Okay, so what's he getting at here? We had a critique in the previous slide of sort of the petty gods of the passions, let's say. Now he's turning to the actual traditions and the beliefs and customs, and it seemed to me he's trying to draw out the illogic, the unreason of those traditions. He says, or the inner contradictions of these traditions. If you at least from a moral point of view, if you worship Victoria, he says, why not also worship the gods who bring about fear and dread and damnation on your neighbouring territory, so you have a just reason to invade them? He's essentially, I think, trying to make the case that though the Romans have tried to construct a hierarchy of values, maybe as an antidote to some of the moral problems, these are the things they do value tend to be perpetuating them. So this is okay. So why is that relevant? Well, because you could say from the previous slide that is a completely the kind of moral problem Rome was experiencing was a completely accidental factor to their actual tradition. But he's trying to root that in the traditions themselves here. The kind of gods you worship are not conducive to good living, and they set the state on a trajectory which perpetuates immorality and injustice on a global scale. The raison d'etre of the Roman state becomes to conquer other nations and to fabricate reasons to do so. And these are the gods they elevate. So it's I think quite a powerful critique. He's had a very creative chapter where he deals with all kinds of inconsistencies in the pagan myths, very much like Socrates had done, but I think it's more entertaining to read because the Roman gods are a bit more interesting. In this paragraph, we decided to run these sessions only for an hour. I'm willing to continue for a little bit if people want to.
Yes, yeah,
continue for another 10, 15 minutes. I've still got a few slides. Oh, great, wonderful. So, okay, let's yeah. He said, these kind of contradictions have existed since Rome's founding, for in reality Romulus, who was the mystical founder of Rome, never claimed to receive his laws from the gods. This is because the Romans enjoyed natural-born equity and virtue, as their historian, another Roman historian. How to explain the various atrocities committed during and after Rome's founding, re their treatment of the innocent and the virtuous. Augustine goes on. Oh, is this my own citation? Oh, sorry, I've intermixed here some of my own notes with the actual quotation, so it's a bit unclear, even to me. Augustine then goes on to cite the rape of the Sabine women, the expulsion of the husband of Lucretia, which is a story about basically the virtuous man Lucius Tarquinius Colentinus, who, despite his virtues, is sort of come up with a charge to get rid of him because of his heritage. The expulsion and subsequent reprisal of the general Marcus Camillus, the brief period of peace and justice which reigned during the Tuscan War, even Sallust suggests was due not to natural virtue but to fear. This is confirmed by the subsequent secession of the plea from the position during the heart yoke. A lot of different references there. Let me try and make sense of it. What he's trying to suggest is, in lots of these different times in Rome's history, you realise that the values they profess are not the values that they actually practice at the level of the state. It's not the motive for the kind of policies they pursue. The myth that emerged of the union of the law and the custom, so the law of the state and the kind of custom, the rites and gods that were worshipped, that they had their unity in Romulus. Augustine argued that a fabrication, which he doesn't come up with himself, but that's reported by Sallust. So he talks a lot about how the politicians publicly encourage the festivities and the gladiators and the circuses and the festival, but privately abhor them. Because they all believe that it's immoral, but they promote it anyway because it's politically expedient. So I wonder what you think of this, Peter, because you suggested a lot about did Augustine's argument go towards trying to bring people under the jurisdiction of the law of the state, but could you not make the case that it's conversely offering a liberation?
from the state.
From the
From
state.
custom.
Yeah, from the state and from the kind of the expediency of the custom, where yeah.
So kind of what I see is actually he's actually doing a rational critique of customs and traditions.
Yes.
Where I always thought you would know this, customs and traditions did not come about rationally, and it wasn't the case that they were reasoned into. They are based on events and historic dynamics and circumstances and political and so on, stuff that went on over centuries.
Yes.
So he's offering that rationalising critique and saying it's ridiculous, you worship this, but you don't worship that, you don't worship that, that makes no sense, which is fine. And then at the end he's going to say Christianity, by contrast, I think would provide this consistency. So you can rationalise Christianity, you can look at it reasonably and come up with and I think he's then going to, in my view, he's going to then create a theological rationality, which I would probably find equally suspect, but nevertheless it's understand. So I think that's what he's doing. And again, he is edging the reader away from entrusting their salvation in the state to entrusting their salvation in Christianity. That's my view of trade-off there. Again, he's abandoning the state for Christian salvation, Christian authority. Unfair?
Yeah, I think so.
You think it's unfair?
No, I think that's a good summary.
Just want to say one other thing. My name is Bruce, not Peter.
Sorry, I thought it was.
Mark said it, didn't he?
Yeah, and then
Mark,
you said
exactly.
And then I thought I got it wrong. So okay, I'm fine. I'm vindicated.
No, it's been a good talk, James. I mean, one thing massively in the backdrop of all this, which is why it's interesting, I mean, you've got to remember in the context of this as well, I find it really interesting that he's consistently criticising the Romans when, at the time that he's writing, there's a potential that Rome doesn't matter anymore. There's this obsession with what's just happened, that Rome's fallen, obviously. But actually, there is the potential that the Roman state is irrelevant now, because as far as he can see, it's falling apart. There's barbarians descending down into Rome. What the aim of this text is to differentiate. This is the thing we really need to remember. It's to differentiate for those who still believe. It's to differentiate between those who are coming. This, the kind of horrible political discourse that we hear these days in terms of like hordes and things like that. But this is the idea that there are these hordes coming down from the north who are going to destroy Rome. But as far as Augustine's concerned, he doesn't care because it failed anyway. But we need to find a way as a Christian stock, as far as he's concerned, to differentiate ourselves. How are we going to be the saved ones against this kind of mass that's going to supersede what Rome was, which, as I say, as a political superstructure doesn't really matter because he thinks it's flawed and failed and just kind of almost a symptom of what is ultimately in the backdrop, millenarianism. It's apocalypticism. This is a book of apocalypticism. The state is going to fall apart, and that's whenever I look at the city of God, it's all I really can see is this idea that you can attempt any structure you like in terms of a political state, but ultimately it's irrelevant because there's this massive Christian backdrop of millenarianism, of the state doesn't actually really matter because it's going to be swept away regardless.
I think he's doing something slightly. So I think you're right. Empire falling apart, a vacuum is being, a power vacuum is being created, and that vacuum will get filled. That vacuum will get filled either by new political powers and/or by Catholic Church. I don't think he, cynically in my view, not trying to save the Catholic Church. So he's not trying to save Catholics or Christians. He's trying to save the Catholic Church. He's saying, in this new world that will come along, where will the Catholic Church fit in? Well, it's not going to be a temporal power because we've never claimed to be that because that was the Romans, and chances are we're not going to be that when new powers arise. So where do we position ourselves such that we have a community of Catholics, and B, temporal powers are not going to try and destroy us. So position ourselves first of all by saying, you will be saved in the next life, not in this one, and Side comment, side whisper to the other powers, don't worry, we're not going to challenge your temporal powers, your temporal authority. Yeah. You do what you do, and we'll do what we do where we plan for the next life, and this will divvied up very nicely.
Yeah.
And you get the city of we get the city of God. You get what's the
City of Man.
City of Man.
Yeah. And do you know what? There's a thinker later on in history who also believes that politics isn't heading in the right direction, and that's de Maistre, who we'll be looking at alongside Montesquieu, who believes that you can structure laws well. In our next session, 2 weeks' time.
Let me know what to wrap up.
Obviously, concluding remarks, etc.
Great, okay. Do come on to that one. Because Montaigne is interesting, de Maistre is incredible, and many of the same themes.
I think Montaigne is incredible, and Jack thinks de Maistre is
That's true. So we didn't quite get to Providence, but this is an underlying theme. Providence will be the primary focus of the next seminar. That's why I wanted to look at de Maistre. Because I summarised the basic metaphysical question is the way God plans for the salvation of man compatible with free will. And I think, personally, it's a subject that is probably given a bit too much metaphysical emphasis. I think it just confuses the issue. Because for me, it's I think for Augustine, although he does give quite a technical defence of it here, it's almost like God's providence is distributed across human experience. So everything that happens to you sort of is an opportunity for you to respond. So the basic claim is that the events are more or less ordained in the sense of having that capacity to afford you moral growth, but that does not at all impinge on the freedom of the human subject to take advantage of that experience, that circumstance, for their own good and for the good of others. That's the basic claim, and it's a providence is a very big subject. It received a lot of philosophical scrutiny, especially in modern times, early modern included, although with the advent of modern science. But the broader aim of the book perhaps hinged on that core idea. So we'll discuss that in more detail next week, I think. Or if anyone would like to join us for drinks at the National Liberal Club. Sorry?
Not next week.
2 weeks' time. 2 weeks' time for de Maistre. If anyone wants to discuss Providence or any of the other issues we've raised this evening, we can do that at the National Liberal Club for those who might like to join us there for drinks. With a dress code, but like decent shoes will do. Great. Well, thank you all for coming.
Well done, Jack.
Very stimulating. Thank you all for your great contributions as well.
And thank you to everyone online. We'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.